Okay, everybody. It seems like a lot of people are starting to come in now, so I think we'll make a start. So, welcome to the fourth webinar in the GGR Insights series. In this case, on making space for place in carbon removal, learning from the communities of St Ives Bay. So, the GGR Insights series is an initiative being run by CORE, the UK's national research hub on greenhouse gas removal. I'm Rob Bellamy. I'm a senior lecturer in climate and society at the University of Manchester and lead on responsible innovation and societal engagement in CORE. In this work package, we've been undertaking a whole range of research to try and understand the societal dimensions of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The topic of today's seminar is based around a particularly significant case of where the societal dimensions have become very relevant in St Ives Bay in the UK, and a piece of recently published research on the topic led by Laurie Waller, who is a research associate in the Department of Geography here at the University of Manchester and a researcher on responsible innovation and societal engagement in CORE. Also in the seminar today, we've got two special guests from the community of St Ives. First of all, Sonara Hodges, who's an independent filmmaker and director of the film Keep Our Sea Chemical Free. And secondly, we've got Sue Sayer, MBE, who's founder and director of the SEAL Research Trust. And before we begin, I'd just like to highlight that this webinar will be recorded and a link will be put on the CORE Hub website. So at this point, without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Sonara.
Hello, and thanks very much for having me to speak. We're just going to watch the trailer to my film first. It's less than a minute long, and then I'll present my slides. So I'll see you in a bit.
At first, I thought it was a hoax.
How is this happening on our doorstep?
They've already done a test.
And we're finding out from the Times newspaper.
And no one in the community had heard about it.
400 tons of magnesium hydroxide into the ocean.
Captures that CO2, turns it into this natural part of seawater.
It's very low risk to you because you don't live here and you don't derive your income from the bay.
You love us for doing this. We're going to save you all.
That just set off the alarm bells, really.
We're not really protesters. What do you do at protest?
Right, let me just sort myself out here. Bear with me. Okay, I'm just going to make this into a slideshow. I've got to tell you, I have never done a slideshow before like this. So please bear with me, and you can give me pointers in the chat for next time. So yeah, normally I just chat or make my film. So yeah, here goes. This is me. And I'm going to give you an outline of what happened when a marine geoengineering project suddenly arrived in St Ives Bay. So this is St Ives. It's an absolutely beautiful town. It's got 11,000 residents. But I really think it's important to know as well that despite its picture postcard perfect image and its £1 million+ homes all over the place, it is actually not a rich town. And in fact, we have pockets of extreme childhood poverty in St Ives, and wages are low and most work is seasonal, which people don't often realise when they come and visit. So in late February 2023, the Times newspaper broke the news to local people about what was happening in their bay. A Canadian company called Planetary Technologies had already carried out a secret test in St Ives Bay and was about to embark on another one. The local community was really shocked and confused, and also there was a sort of pervasive sense of powerlessness. The next experiment was about to happen, and as far as we knew, it had been waved through by whoever was in charge. At this point, there was really only one story in town and only one source of information. Planetary Technologies materialized with a fully formed narrative, and it was a great one. They were combating climate change and they were healing the ocean. Their science was excellent and their safety protocols second to none. It was a climate emergency and excessive caution was inappropriate. The next test would happen in a matter of weeks and then they would scale up. Fabulous. We had absolutely no one to check any of this with. It was really an information vacuum filled by one perspective, and that was Planetary Technologies. In March 2023, a group of local residents formed Keep Our Sea Chemical Free to try to get answers to some basic questions. What was the experiment? How was it being implemented and funded? What was the science underpinning it? And the answers we received were contradictory and confusing, to say the least. Planetary Technologies told us the next experiment was variously either 500 tons, 1,000 tons, 2,000 tons. A few weeks later, they decided to change the dosage rate of the test, which they said was due to public concern. This should have been reassuring, but actually I found it worrying because it seemed to suggest the test was more about PR than actual science. Planetary talked about experiments in coral reefs and said the alkalinity in St Ives Bay would change and the shellfish would love it. But at the same time, they said the alkalinity would be far too dispersed to have any impact at all. And when we told Planetary there were historic mine toxins in the bay, it was news to them. At one of the very first public meetings, someone did a rough calculation based on Planetary scaling up plans that the company itself had proudly labelled as insane. I guess this descriptor might go down well in Silicon Valley, but it just sounded worrying to us. The scaling up plans just seemed implausible, but every time Planetary were questioned, they robustly defended their schedule. Until about a year later, when they quietly scaled back their stated ambitions, slipping them by a full decade. There is something quite remarkable about the fact that a Cornish resident sitting in a public meeting and hearing about these scaling up plans, in fact, hearing about Planetary Technology at all for the first time, spotted this hyperbole a full year before Planetary themselves dialed it back. It was hard to avoid Elon Musk's involvement via the X Prize, although Planetary said Elon personally had probably never heard of them. But in those early meetings, Planetary were very cagey about funding, suggesting that they were financially supported by friends and family and dodging questions about their business model. In fact, they had multiple investors, links to the mining industry, and had already sold their own version of carbon credits to companies like Shopify. Our bay had already been monetized by Planetary Technologies, and local people had known nothing about it. It was a beautiful photo of our bay, like this one, hanging on the wall of some CEO's office in Canada or in America, making everyone feel great about combating climate change. There was a huge amount of concern in the local community. We wanted transparency and we wanted more scrutiny. And as a town councillor, I proposed a motion calling for three things: a delay to the start of the next experiment, an environmental impact assessment, and a proper public consultation. In fact, our local town council was so outraged that a test had happened already without anyone informing us that they voted down any testing in the bay outright. This had no legal weight, but sent a strong message about consent. We were stunned by the number of people who turned out for our first protest, over 300 people. It was one of the two largest community protests in recent memory, the other being in support of our local hospital when it was closed. The protest was a really important moment for us. Our opposition to the way Planetary's experiment was being handled now had a physical shape. We had a counter-narrative, a story of local people with a huge amount of knowledge and a desire to protect and enhance our local marine ecosystem. We also cared deeply about the climate crisis, and we knew these two things were not mutually exclusive. The protest meant our community suddenly became visible nationally and internationally. our concerns and questions had a platform, and journalists and scientists began to contact us and to write about our experiences in St Ives Bay and about some of the wider questions surrounding the technique that planetary technologies were using, which was ocean alkalinity enhancement. We maintained a polite, if careful, correspondence with Planetary. For me, one letter I received relating to the broader issues of emissions reductions exemplified their view of us. Planetary seemed to think we lived in some kind of Cornish Luddite information silo. In a letter I wrote back to the Vice President in February 2024, I tried to explain this. When there is a disagreement, your company tends to assume that residents don't understand the issues and need to be further educated. The assumption is that when we are properly educated, we will agree with PT's experimental and business model. PT is short for planetary technologies. By April 2024, Planetary were ghosting us, but also insisting they were still committed to testing in Cornwall. Were they pulling out or about to scale up? Locals literally had no idea. So almost a year after the first demonstration, we gathered again to highlight the role, this time of South West Water in the joint enterprise, because it was South West Water's sewage pipe that went out into the bay and was going to be delivering the magnesium hydroxide. One of the remarkable things about this second protest was the flotilla of fishing and working boats that joined us, and we were even covered in Fishing News, which I'm told is a very big deal. And then just as suddenly as Planetary had crash landed into our lives, just earlier this year in April 2025, they suddenly disappeared in their very own somewhat embarrassing signal gate moment, which I won't go into now, but it turned out that we could break the news to everyone that they were leaving town. For me, David Santillo, who's an expert in the legal framework around marine carbon dioxide removal, best explained what our community had achieved. It sends a message to one of the self-styled leading proponents of marine geoengineering and carbon removals at a global level that they cannot justify their corporate activities on the basis of poor quality science. It shows that people are watching these companies and prepared to put themselves on the line to challenge their proposals on their own technical rationale. And it shows that when you do that, and when those technical grounds are found to be somewhat hollow, then there's nowhere else for their arguments to go. It was their information that they brought to the table, and I think by the end, even they recognised they had not made their case. There have been some really great things that came out of all of this, and getting to know Sue, who's your next speaker, is the best one of all. Thank you very much. That's me done. I'm going to try and unshare my screen. Hold on, bear with me. There we go.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sinara. We'd like to now hand over to Sue.
Thank you very much. Get my screen up. Does that look okay to you, Rob? Lovely.
Yep, that's looking
Okay.
good.
So my name is Sue Sayer. I want to explain that we are a seal research trust, and our unique selling point is we do photo ID on individual seals. So the photo of this seal, she's called Shadow Puppet. We've known her since 2000. She's still alive in 2025. For us, seals are sentient individuals with their own right to life, but they are also sentinels that bring stories, and they're worrying ones, to us on land about the state of our seas. Always like to thank our funders, because without them we wouldn't exist and we wouldn't be able to look after our volunteers, but we only have 2 full-time equivalent paid people in our charity. So I want to talk about really what we've learned from the experience. We are a marine conservation charity. We believe in the ecozoic, where we believe that we're one species upon a planetary ecosystem that we depend. And this is about seals and people. People think I do seals, but actually it's more about people, because we can't help the marine ecosystem without people. I have a massive generation guilt, because it's our generation that have screwed up the planet, and now we're relying on future generations to solve it. It is my passion to protect the next generation of seals and people. As Sonara has shown you, our bay is beautiful. It's the best beach in the UK. It has an iconic seascape that inspired a very famous book, and it's a really important site for seals. It's at the hub of the Celtic Sea, and after 10 weeks after the Planetary Technologies secret release, seals suddenly started using a brand new haul out that they had not used in our 25-year history prior to that. We also have one of 2 key pupping sites in the southwest of England, and impacts at this particular site can be felt across the Celtic Sea. So this is not an isolated place where impacts would not vary. We have been concerned about climate change for a long time because seals are bringing all sorts of information to us on land about the impacts that climate change is already having on them. So this is a leaflet that we have about climate change impacts on seals, and we also have a short film about it. So on to planetary technologies. So obviously it's the CDR OAE Marine Geoengineering project, and we first heard about it in 2023. We discovered when there was a public meeting that this secret trial had happened in September 2022, and there were going to be 2 public events talking about it to raise awareness for members of the public. This only happened because the enforcement agency, the licensing agency, insisted that they do some public engagement. I had actually heard about the project back in January 2023 when Planetary Technologies went to a Cornwall Marine Liaison Group meeting, and I frankly was stunned. I asked lots of questions, but nobody else was asking questions, so in the end I shut up and didn't do anything about it until a lady called Claire Wallerstein, who runs Cornwall Climate Care and makes loads of documentaries about climate change, got in touch and said, "Sue, what are you doing?" And I went, "Oh, I'm actually not doing anything." I was inactive, stunned, and completely in shocked silence. So the next thing I knew is I'd been contacted by the Times newspaper, which Sonara showed you. And as we started to drill into these public engagement events that were held, we realized that cracks were appearing. The Planetary Technologies had a lack of background knowledge. They didn't know what lived in the bay. They didn't know about the water chemistry. They didn't know about the substrate, and they didn't understand our community, as Sonara has said. Unfortunately, the approach was patronising, as Sonara has also alluded to, and then they started offering us money. Surely we wanted some more volunteers, which actually we didn't. So this is the size of a speck of dust in reality, but it is a microplastic monster. These are tiny fibres that washed into the ocean that are currently in there, literally the size of a speck of dust. Will we learn from the experience that we have with plastics that many of the things that we do as a human society have unintended consequences, and will we transfer that learning to to carbon dioxide removal? So we started to learn a lot more and upskill ourselves. We decided we would be brave. We started to share the experience of Planetary Technologies at all the meetings that we attend. People started queuing up to help us and give us information. We were contacted by experts and different organisations. Our volunteers, some of them have PhDs in geochemistry, started looking at papers for us and giving us short summaries of them. We looked at a lot of key science papers. Funders started offering us money to look into this issue, and we began to understand the bigger picture thanks to organisations such as Hands Off Mother Earth and Centre for International Environmental Law, giving us background information about the London Convention and London Protocol, with which we had no prior knowledge. All of a sudden, we were no longer the odd one out in the pool on our own. We had other people supporting and helping us. So we moved into a new time of proaction where we began asking questions. This was never about saying no to this project. It was always about saying we can say yes when we are satisfied that this project is as safe as it possibly can be. So we asked questions, we wrote to licensing authorities, to South West Water, to other organisations, to the Water Research Centre, and we started to lead meetings. So we found our voice. We started to be confident enough to ask these questions repeatedly. We shared the seal site changes that I talked about earlier, the new haul out. We started extending our comfort zones, and we discovered that other people didn't know the answers to the questions that we were asking. The baselines were inadequate. As far as we were aware, and other people were telling us, you could only model the amount of carbon dioxide drawdown that would take place. You couldn't measure it. And we suddenly realised how inadequate the monitoring was going to be for the project. And if you don't look for changes, you won't find changes. So you'll assume that there aren't any changes, which is clearly not correct. We started compiling inputs. We did the UN one first on a public consultation. I did a 3-minute talk input at a White House scientific briefing. We briefed our MPs. They were asking us questions about the project. We did lots of international media inquiries and we participated in research. We requested meetings with Planetary Technologies, which we had multiple meetings, face-to-face, actually sat here in this office, some of them. We had meetings with South West Water Online, whose infrastructure were being used, and we had meetings with universities. We began to be the early bird catching the worm ahead of the curve, which a lot of people were unaware of. Sonara arranged the first protest, and I'd never met Sonara before, and I'd never attended a protest before. But I agreed that I would give a balanced overview as I saw it of the project, so I did speak at the protest. In March 2024, we had, March 2024, we had a pivotal presentation with Planetary Technologies. Cornwall Carbon Scrutiny Group, who we'd been set up to look at this project from a balanced and non-biased viewpoint, requested this presentation from Planetary Technologies about what they were calling their baseline survey results from the project. They'd done 2 days of surveying in the Bay and they called it a baseline. So multiple questions were asked at the Zoom session, which was recorded. So we were also able to share it with statutory agencies afterwards. But Planetary Technologies chief scientist agreed when asked that they didn't actually have a baseline. A baseline included seasonal variation, and they didn't have an international baseline. An inter-annual baseline. They didn't have an intra and inter-annual baseline, and they actually didn't have a suitable control site because when they did the dive surveys, they didn't find what they expected in terms of substrate. So we started doing surveys in the Bay. We were funded to do this. We looked at 4 sites, which we repeated. We're aiming to do that 3 times a year for 3 years. Thank you very much to the Flotilla Foundation and to Portsmouth and Oxford universities for supporting this research. And we've done July to August 2024, and we've done July to August 2025, and we plan to do them in 2026. This is what Planetary Technologies should have done before they started the project. So we have volunteer divers on the project. We're looking at habitats and species. We're also looking at the water chemistry because of our mining heritage. And we're also looking at eDNA to find out about other species in the water. This is what our underwater bay looks like. It's magical. I had no idea because I have never seen it myself. So it was fantastic to get this footage and photos. And it is truly stunningly beautiful. And this cannot be risked unless we have some robust science to say that the technology is going to be as safe as it possibly can. Sonara alluded to the signal gate, and the letter that was drafted for me, which I got the following day rather than a week later, said that the project was conducted safely with no detectable impact on the local ecosystem. All they did was they did 2 days of data. They didn't have any data to prove that there was no detectable impact on the local ecosystem. I can't say that the seals moving was related to that project, but equally they can't say that it wasn't, and it was robust data. They couldn't even spell the name of the town where we live, so that didn't speak well to their attention to detail. And if it is so successful, why is the Cornwall project being completely and utterly removed from their website? Basically, we were asking questions about the science, and the science just wasn't good enough. We were delighted to participate in the core workshop in St Ives Bay to look at how governance and community involvement could be done in the future based on the experience, and looking forward to the report that will be produced as a result of that. So to finish, nature-based solutions are preferable because they have biodiversity benefits in order to draw down carbon dioxide. All of us need to take individual actions to reduce our carbon footprint, but major companies need to get to net zero as soon as possible before they start doing geoengineering projects. You should only be able to buy a carbon credit if you have proven that you've reduced your carbon emissions to as much as possible. We need to empower ourselves to act. We didn't ever say no, we just kept asking questions. We think that large-scale closed water trials need to happen before any open water ocean trials happen. And when Planetary Technologies were asked what happens if this goes wrong, they would said that they won't go out of business. And we said, and what will happen to our bay, because there will be irreversible changes. So seals are oblivious that their future is in our hands. Will we as a species even have a future? My top tip to any company, and I've given some companies advice, is to go slow. Get that 3-year baseline, learn about the place that you're going to be experimenting in, and ask lots of questions yourself. Don't just go with the narrative that you've come up with. What is our motivation for this project? But the most important thing is what will be the legacy for the children who are already 6 years old, who are going to have a real challenging life, potentially on a non-livable planet. That's me finished. I'll stop sharing. Thank you very much for listening. Hope it's been interesting.
Fantastic. That was very interesting. Thank you, Sue. And now we'll hand over to Laurie.
Yeah, let me just get my slides up. Can you see that okay? Great. Yes, so I'm Laurie Waller. I'm a researcher at Manchester Geography and with CORE, and I'm a sociologist by training. So I worked with Sue and the Seal Research Trust to study the controversy that developed around this ocean alkalinity enhancement trial. And as part of that work, I interviewed some of those who participated in the community protests. I attended one of the protests myself and analysed the archive of documents collected by the Seal Research Trust about the trial, and that's available on the Seal Research Trust's website. So looking at the situation that developed around the trial as a controversy is a deliberate analytical choice. In short, it means that I adopt an agnostic stance towards claims about the efficacy of the ocean alkalinity enhancement method for carbon sequestration and the environmental risks of the proposed experiment. What I argue in the paper that has just been published is that underlying disputes about efficacy and risk were two very different constructions of St Ives Bay and the place of the marine environment in everyday community life. So to analyse the controversy, I look closely at the practices used by the Bay's communities to demonstrate local concerns about potential impacts and contest the framing of the experiment as a small-scale test. So as Sue and Sonara have shown, the protests brought together members of the Bay's communities into association and generated novel forms of collective inquiry into ocean alkalinity enhancement and marine carbon removal in the Bay more generally. And a key point Sue mentioned, but I want to also emphasise, is that many of those I spoke to did not, in principle, oppose research or trials of marine carbon removal methods. So a little bit of zooming out to some sociological theory. Field trials are classically experimental formats where a proof already established in a laboratory is publicly demonstrated outdoors. Sociologists have often looked at trials as an adversarial drama where competing knowledge claims are put to test. And by doing this, by looking at it as a kind of drama, they've shown that field trials, or the in-field trials, the identity of the field location is often strategically publicised by the demonstrators in order to dramatise the sort of placeless character of scientific knowledge. So this is an image from Louis Pasteur's 19th century animal vaccination experiments. It's obviously a fictional picture of it. And the quote next to it is from the science studies scholar Bruno Latour. In Latour's well-known account, the persuasive force of Pasteur's field trials resided in presenting the provincial farm as a site completely unlike a controlled in a laboratory environment. So in practice, Latour argued, Pasteur actually transformed the farm into a laboratory-like setting, and that was a reality disguised in the public drama of the trial. And you can see in this picture, Pasteur is just out in the field, in the wild. Whether or not we agree with Latour's polemical account, I think his argument helpfully brings into focus the idea that field trials are not just experimental procedures, but are highly symbolic moments of demonstration and a particular way of publicising a place. So Planetary publicised the trial in St Ives Bay as a small-scale test. Of course, if scale is a measure of material impact, for many of those I spoke to, the experiment appeared far from small and potentially very consequential. So what is the measure of scale being invoked here? One answer, I suggest, can be found in the state of carbon removal reports, which have been produced by various colleagues in CORE, including Rob, who's on this call, and which are very useful guides to the field. So in these reports, there's a model of innovation which is on the left-hand side of the screen, and the second step in that is a demonstration phase, which is prior to scale up, and that's where field trials conventionally sort of located. So by definition in this model, they are small scale. So I want to suggest that in many ways, Planetary's trial resonated with the archetype of the carbon removal demonstration that we find in this linear model, and that the controversy around the trial therefore tells us something quite important about how communities feature in current thinking about the innovation of carbon removal methods. So this linear model featured in the innovation chapter of the first State of Carbon Removal report, and subsequently provided the organising structure for the second report. So it's an important device not just for thinking about innovation, but is also playing a role in organising the scientific assessment of carbon removal. So the model shows a one-way trajectory of technology from research and development to public acceptance. And demonstrations occupy a critical position between research and development and scale up. So they're effectively a bridge between science and markets. So as the last step in the trajectory of the technology, the public is positioned as very distant from the demonstration phase. And that's obviously quite important. There's, of course, much more to the State of Carbon Removal reports than this linear model, and I think it's important to emphasise that. But its inclusion also shows that these reports are not just scientific assessments, but also express a particular, in a very particular way, the emerging regime governing the innovation of carbon removal methods and the public issues associated with them. So I would not be doing my job as a social researcher if I didn't point out that linear models like this assume that research and development takes place largely out of public view, and therefore such models do not represent community concerns as legitimate contestation of science and technology. So community concerns are rather typically seen to stem from a deficit of scientific understanding and as representing a barrier to technology deployment, which is otherwise assumed to be in the public interest. So I think this model is quite significant if we want to understand how framing field trials as small-scale tests can generate public controversy. And so I'm interested in exploring the resonance between the controversy in St Ives and the models that we find in reports like the State of Carbon Removal. So Susan and I have spoken in detail about the proposed experiment. So I'm going to focus here mainly on how Planetary's design for the trial was represented St Ives Bay as a field site. So Planetary's website was the primary vehicle through which the trial was publicised. And while the web page changed over time, one feature that appeared quite consistent was the emphasis on the ideal conditions of this part of the Cornish coast for testing ocean alkalinity enhancement. The scope and design of the trial was initially published in a report by Planetary, which was funded through a competition for proof of concept projects run by the UK's then Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And that report describes the bay's physical setting, so situated on the northwest facing coast of Cornwall with large sand dune beach enclosed by cliff-fronted headlands. And this makes the bay a site of consistently powerful tidal flows. So the bay's distinctive tidal conditions would enable the treated slurry to mix quickly and remain in the upper layer of the water column where it could react with the air, maximizing the potential for air-sea carbon sequestration before dispersion. And I'm taking that description quite almost directly from the report. I think it's quite conspicuous that St Ives Bay is not actually named or not actually addressed by name in the report. And Planetary's construction of St Ives Bay, I think, as an ideal site for testing ocean alkalinity enhancement, can be seen to follow primarily from an analysis of the physical characteristics and based on ocean physics modelling. And this is important because it makes clear that St Ives Bay was an ideal field site insofar as it exemplified a specific oceanic condition. So the bay was an oceanic exemplar against which Planetary's models for carbon removal and sequestration could be validated. So in modelling the bay as an oceanic exemplar, I suggest that Planetary's experiment design also implied a social construction of the bay that framed the communities out of the experimental field, implying that the bay's communities could be easily disentangled from the marine environment. So students and I have talked in detail about the community response, and my analysis initially focused on trying to understand the formation of the Cornwall Carbon Scrutiny Group, which they've talked about, and that's the named entity under which local experts, including conservation groups, scientists, activists, and others had met and engaged the companies and officials. So in sociology, there's been a lot of interest in collectives like the CCSG and the role that they play in demonstrations of local concern, which can make sort of explicit problematic dimensions of science and technology. So far from opposing research and development, sociologists have shown that collectives like the CCSG can pose unforeseen problems for research and policy and stimulate novel practices of knowledge production. And I think we saw that evidence very well in Sunara's talks. So one of the things that was notable, however, in the interviews I conducted was that relatively few people mentioned this group, the CCSG, by name. So if a novel kind of knowledge collective had emerged from the bay's communities, its identity was not obviously characterized by this group alone. A key feature in understanding the formation of the Cornwall Carbon Scrutiny Group seemed to be the practices of demonstration used to connect together the spectacle of community protest with the bay's expert communities. And in this respect, the sort of key feature, I think, in the formation of the Cornwall Carbon Scrutiny Group was not only the identities of the individuals involved, but also the specific landscape features around which those practices of demonstration were organised. I use the term shoreline demonstrations to characterise how the bay's communities connected the sort of elaborate spectacles we saw of community protest with the kind of expert discussions and concerns about regulatory decision-making, coastal economies, protected ecosystems, and geochemical uncertainties. So shoreline was significant, I suggest, because it could demonstrate the entanglement of the bay's onshore communities with the nearshore site of the trial. So each of these features could be shown to be entangling of those two settings. The shoreline demonstrations could therefore contest the framing of the trial as a small-scale test, which confined the experiment to the marine environment. And the demonstrators could instead show that the consequences of the trial could potentially directly impact the community. So I've included here a table which is also in the published paper, which just tries to map together those features of the shoreline to the different dimensions of the controversy and the role that the sort of expert groups and the community protests played in raising and publicising those concerns. And yeah, in the paper, I also then map those features to these those dimensions of the controversy to the features, and you can see them here illustrated on the map. Yeah, so I'm going to close with some thoughts about community-led carbon removal. So what do I mean by this? Well, there are certainly people out there starting to explore models of public ownership, management and maintenance of carbon removal projects. And I've also seen some early thinking about how carbon removal credits could be linked to community assets. And those are, of course, very interesting developments. But I also think they might struggle to make headway so long as researchers and project developers address the public primarily as a lay audience and define communities affected by projects using physical models of field sites. So as Sue and Sonara have shown us, the identity of those demonstrating at the shoreline was not easily reduced to these neat distinctions between the community, the stakeholders, and civil society. The identity of the demonstrators was rather, I suggested, precisely defined by the place, the shoreline, that was obscured by framings of the trial as a small-scale test. So from the shoreline, the proposed field site appeared a setting of complex society-environment interaction and connection between the bay's communities. And the experiment would therefore implicate potentially multiple public authorities, and in some cases, it was not necessarily even clear what kinds of decision-making power or processes would be at work in the trial. So as we show in the paper, the shoreline features around which the demonstrations were organised, the outfall pipe, the sand dunes, the Red River and the harbours, were in various respects already objects of local concern and contention around issues like water pollution, species and habitat protection, historic mining contamination and socio-economic inequalities. And in this respect, the demonstrations can also be seen as resisting a kind of depoliticised account of the bay's communities. They didn't erase existing conflicts in the bay, but showed how the trial would intervene and in some cases actually reanimate them. So I guess the proposition I want to make here in terms of community-led carbon removal is that identifying communities affected by carbon removal projects may require a sort of intimate knowledge of the everyday life of field sites and the issues that animate public engagement with them. I think there's a great photo, I think Sonara showed it, of the Keep Our Seas Chemical-Free protesters on the beach in their swimming costumes, demonstrating an intimate relation to the affected site. Yeah, and I mean, given that carbon removal has so far to date largely developed around global emission scenarios and models, most projects will start from a deficit of this kind of knowledge. So I want to suggest that we could think about carbon removal trials not only as testing promising technologies, but also testing project developers' knowledge about the ecologies and everyday community life in which they will intervene. And yeah, thank you for listening and looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Laurie. Okay, so we now have about 10 minutes or so for questions and discussion. So please, if you do have any questions for any of our panelists, please post them in the Q&A. So I'm going to abuse my position as chair and ask a question first of all, which was triggered by something that you said, Sonara, in your initial presentation, kind of quoting, I think it was David Santillo, who referred to these kinds of experiments as geoengineering, which is a very it's kind of quite a touchy subject in our area. So I'm just wondering your views, all three of you really, like, is this geoengineering?
Well, none of us had heard really the term geoengineering before it arrived on our doorstep. So it's not that weighted. It wasn't that weighted for me. I didn't know that there were controversies around it at all. Now I do. I haven't got a scientific opinion on whether it counts as geoengineering. I don't really mind what it counts as. I guess, are people like concerned about how it looks to the public if you label it as geoengineering? Is that the issue here that we're talking about?
It could be.
Yeah, I don't know how Sue feels about it.
We kind of had a bit of a hierarchy in our heads, really, because we've been told about bioengineering when you, for example, get rather than just encouraging seaweed to grow naturally, but you add strings to encourage the seaweed to grow better. So we were told that that was called bioengineering. And when therefore, we just assumed that geoengineering was a kind of an accepted phrase, a word for this kind of topic. And as Sonara said, we had no idea that it was a controversial word at all. But we kind of thought that nature-based solutions were the best option, and bioengineering were probably the next best option, and that the least best option was the geoengineering option when the others had been exhausted. But yeah, we didn't realise it was controversial. And it'd be interesting to know why it's controversial, to be honest.
I actually was super excited when I first heard about it, having been a climate activist for decades. When I heard the hype, I was like, amazing, this is fabulous. You know, it was only when I started asking questions and drilled down into it that I realized the hyperbole and the other issues that were being ignored. And I've got to say, now I'm at the other end of that spectrum, having not understood or known about geoengineering. Having gone through this process, I'm now very skeptical, and kind of like more aware of especially the scaling up issues. So yeah, that's where I am now.
So I think for the purposes of social analysis, I'm not sure I find the term geoengineering super helpful as a concept to use. I mean, typically it means it's a way of looking at the environment as a sort of planetary, as having planetary consequences, or environmental action as having planetary consequences. I suppose that in trying to understand, I think what's going on in a place like St Ives Bay, it's more distracting, or it obscures far more than it reveals as an analytical term. But I do think it's important to recognise that the term is often used, I think, by concerned groups because it's not used very often by scientists these days, but it can be used by concerned groups and also activists and environmental NGOs to raise questions about the motivations for doing experiments, and to also question the framing of these experiments as small scale. So as a way of provoking thought about these questions, I guess it still has it has a social life of its own in a way. But for the purposes of empirical social analysis, I'm not sure I find it particularly useful.
Brilliant, thanks. We'll come to Sue, and then afterwards we've got some questions starting to roll in.
I was just going to say that for me, now I've had time to think about it, I feel that bioengineering is when you manipulate the biology, and maybe geoengineering is when you manipulate the geography. End of.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so we've got a question from Steve, first of all. So I'll read it to you. The protest line, "No chemicals in our bay," is a nice one. It makes me think that there are probably other chemicals flowing into the bay from the sewage pipe already. Throughout this process, did you discover more about existing environmental threats to the bay, and did that shift your perspective or protest aims at all? Sue?
Yes, so the dive surveys have been fascinating. So the site 1 is right next to the sewage outfall, and site 4 is as far away as you can get in the bay from the sewage outfall. And what we've discovered has been counterintuitive. Basically, the habitat is more complex by the sewage outfall, but the biodiversity is the least complex. Normally, when you have complex habitat, you have complex species, and that isn't the case by the sewage outfall. However, when you go to site 4 furthest away, where you have the least complex habitat, you have the greatest biodiversity. That's been an interesting finding. I'm not sure we understand why. We can't directly relate it to the sewage outfall, but nevertheless, it's interesting.
Brilliant, thank you, Sue. Sonara?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for liking the name, because initially I thought it sounded so unscientific, because obviously the world is full of chemicals, we are chemicals, but we voted on it and it kind of has a ring to it, and yeah, I'm glad it kind of vaguely makes sense. So what I wanted to say is, because many of us are in the sea or observing the sea all the time, the stuff going into the sea is a huge issue. I mean, you just have to look at the Red River. People who used to swim near it before was seeing mine runoff going into the sea all the time. We're constantly getting sick from swimming in the sewage, which is getting worse and worse. You know, the irony of Planetary joining with Southwest Water for this just shows how little they understood about this absolutely hated water company, one of the worst polluting water companies in the UK. So and also, yeah, and the nutrient runoff as well. So I think because we live by the sea, we are super aware of it. There are loads of local groups. There's one called Shit Ahoy, which tracks things happening. We've got Surfers Against Sewage, fishing people observe and let people know on Facebook or whatever. So people are just very aware, because here we are looking at it all the time. I mean, I look out of my window and I see slicks sometimes in the bay, or if we've had a really big storm, the bay is purple because of like the earth and the sort of landfalls that happen. So yeah, I just think we see it all the time.
Thank you, Sue, and then we'll come to another question.
Yeah, I was also thinking that we've had harmful algal blooms in the bay this April that were worse than we've had in previous years, to some extent. I don't know how that's not a long data set for me. It's a new experience. And the other thing to say is that we have a big mine at South Crofty that is about to restart mining for tin in Cornwall, and the outflow from that mine goes into the bay. So whilst my initial plan was to go back, because the funding's run out for the dive surveys now, but we need 3 years worth. So I was originally going to go back and ask for 1 year, but effectively that will be a good baseline, and they will start mining tin in 2027. So in order to assess whether there are any impacts from mining the tin in the marine environment, maybe we need to ask for 4 years more worth of data so that we can actually see the impacts of that. And of course, if Planetary Technologies were dosing now, the impact of the mine will have a cumulative impact, which is quite interesting. And there are loads of other things happening. We've had seabed mining proposed in St Ives Bay as well. So there are all sorts of things going on that complicate the issue and lead to those cumulative impacts.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so we've got a question from Javier now. So how does the community plan to use this experience and knowledge, including scientific data, going forward? So even if Planetary Technologies is no longer planning a trial there, do they plan to remain engaged in debates and possibly future studies around carbon dioxide removal?
Shall I start? I'd just say that Planetary Technologies are totally ignoring us and what happened here. We are wiped from their memory. We are not mentioned anymore on their website. I think we are a massive embarrassment, but obviously they are carrying on. There are loads of ocean alkalinity projects happening in the US and other places. But what we are trying to do with my film, and also we've made a website, is to talk to communities about how to ask questions, you know, how to make yourself more visible, what to do. And actually it applies to any issues facing your community, really. So I want to continue talking to people and learning more about it personally. What about you, Sue?
Yeah, so this isn't NIMBYism. This isn't we're just doing it because it's on our patch. We genuinely care about every bit aspect of the marine environment and understand that it's all interconnected. So we feel that, well, I feel that I have a responsibility to keep being engaged with this issue. And as long as people are interested to know and want to learn from the experience, that's why we were so keen to participate in the core website that took in the core workshop that took place in St Ives, because we want to learn the max we can out of this, and we want that learning to be shared with other people so that we really do get better governance for this kind of project, and we really do get communities involved at the planning stages of these projects, because communities do generally know their community better geography, biology, the whole lot better than people who are new to the area.
Brilliant, thanks. Okay, so we've got a few questions. I'm conscious we're probably not going to get through them all. So if anyone does want to follow up with any of our panelists today, please do get in touch with them. I'm sure they'll be very happy to speak to you. So one question here is a good one from Leonard. So do the protesters have opinions more generally on ocean alkalinity enhancement field trials at other locations? So for example, Planetary have to date reported they've removed around 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide using this technique in Halifax Harbour in Nova Scotia. So the question is the protest more about the location or the idea of removing carbon in general?
I think it's really hard to speak for a community made up of hundreds of different people who came. Everyone had different reasons for being there. Some people were really concerned about the science. Some people were concerned about the kind of moral hazard of pushing these schemes while our government continues to kind of build runways and, you know, invest in fossil fuels. And so I think Halifax Harbour is a really different one because Planetaries have a long history there and they work with the university, and they seem to be more embedded in the community. Also, I suspect because it's quite an industrial location, then what they're doing feels less radical almost, with such a pristine looking environment that I think it had sort of more impact for us. What do you think, Sue?
I would just also question the 2,000 tonnes because that's modelled amounts, not measured amounts. So it's unfortunately guesswork.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, we've just clocked on to 12:58, and in my instructions, I've been told to close down at that time. So we do have a few extra questions there. Apologies we couldn't get to those, but as I say, I'm sure our panelists would be very happy to answer those questions to you if you drop them a line. So without further ado, I'd just like to say thank you again to all of our panelists, and highlight the next seminar in our GGR Insights seminar series, which will be on monitoring, reporting and verification, or MRV, for sustainable and credible greenhouse gas removal in a global context, which is taking place on Wednesday, the 19th of November, at the same time from 12 till 1 p.m. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.